Let your body settle now, wherever you are resting. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands open gently. Let the weight of the day dissolve like mist off a quiet river at dawn. Tonight, we are going somewhere ancient and beautiful, a world of cold green seas and pine-dark shores, of firelight and salt air, of people who sailed farther than anyone had dared before. Close your eyes softly, take one slow breath, and let yourself drift. There is a place in the far north of the world where the land breaks apart into fjords, long fingers of dark water reaching deep between mountains, so steep and so tall that in winter the sun barely clears their shoulders. The rock faces are grey-green with lichen, and the pines grow thick and heavy with snow, and below them the water lies still and black as polished iron. The air here tastes of cold, of pine resin, of something ancient and clean. In the early morning, mist curls off the water in slow spirals, and the only sounds are the soft knock of a wooden boat against a stone dock, the cry of a gull somewhere far above, and the distant gentle creak of ice shifting in the night. This is Scandinavia, at the edge of the world as people once imagined it, and it is here, in this quiet and extraordinary landscape, that one of the most remarkable chapters in all of human history began to stir, the age of the Norse people, the age that history would come to call the Viking Age. But let us not rush there, not yet. Let us first understand the world these people came from, the world that shaped them, the world that eventually could no longer contain them. Imagine a village on the coast of what we would now call Norway, sometime in the 8th century, perhaps around the year 780 or so. The houses are long and low, built of timber and turf, their roofs thick with dried grass. Inside, a central fire burns along the length of the great hall, its smoke finding its way upward through a narrow gap in the roof, and around that fire sit perhaps a dozen families, grandparents and children and young men and women, eating their evening meal of smoked fish and barley broth. The light is amber and wavering. Outside, the wind moves through the pines. These people are farmers and fishermen, craftspeople and traders. They keep cattle on the narrow strips of valley land between the fjords. They tend small fields of rye and oats in the brief, pale summers. They are deeply skilled with their hands, at carving, at weaving, at working iron and bone and antler into tools and ornaments of extraordinary refinement. They worship gods whose names are still with us today in the very days of our week. Odin, the wandering god of wisdom and poetry and death, whose name gives us Wednesday. Thor, the thunderer, whose hammer is protection and power, whose name gives us Thursday. Freya and Frigg and Tyr, and the whole shining, stormy company of the Norse gods, who lived in Asgard and feasted in their golden halls and rode across the sky when the northern lights blazed. The people in that long hall know the stars intimately. They can read the sky the way we might read a map. They know the behavior of currents, the color of water at different depths, the smell of land approaching before it appears above the horizon. Because in this landscape, the sea is not a barrier. The sea is the road, the mountains are the barrier, the fjords and the open water are the highways. And in the 8th century, the Norse had something no other people in the known world possessed. A ship that could travel that highway as no vessel ever had before. Let your breathing slow a little more. Let the images soften at the edges, like a landscape seen through gentle rain. The Viking longship is one of the most beautiful objects ever made by human hands. Think about that for a moment. Centuries upon centuries after the last one was built, scholars and sailors who study these vessels still speak of them with something approaching reverence. They were clinker-built, meaning the planks of the hull overlapped one another like the scales of a fish, each plank riveted to the next, giving the hull a flexibility that solid plank construction could never achieve. This flexibility was crucial. In heavy seas, the longship did not fight the waves. It moved with them. It bent and flexed and rode the swells the way a living creature rides them, rather than a rigid box that might crack or fill with water. The hull was shallow, astonishingly shallow for a seagoing vessel. A fully crewed longship might draw only a few feet of water, which meant it could navigate not just the open ocean, but rivers. It could beach on a sandy shore. It could slide up onto gravel, and the crew could step out into ankle-deep water. It could go anywhere water went. And a single mast carried a large square sail of woven wool, dyed in bright stripes of red and ochre and cream, which when full of wind could carry the ship at remarkable speeds across hundreds of miles of open sea. These ships were the key that opened the world. Without them, there is no Viking Age. With them, a people who had been largely confined to their dramatic, beautiful, but agriculturally limited homeland suddenly found themselves able to reach the entire known world and beyond. Imagine the first time a Norse crew sailed a fully rigged longship out of a fjord and into open water, the sail filling with wind, the ship rising and plunging through the swells, the spray cold and sharp on every face, and the whole grey-blue infinity of the sea stretching ahead of them. What must that have felt like? To feel the ship come alive beneath you, to feel the speed, to see the coast of home shrinking behind you, and the world opening up ahead like a book whose pages no one had read. That feeling, that possibility, is where the Viking Age was born. The reasons why it happened when it did are layered and complex, as the reasons for any great human movement always are. There was the practical matter of land. Scandinavia is not a generous agricultural country. The mountains crowd the valleys. The good farmland is narrow and precious. Families grew. Sons who could not inherit their father's small farm needed somewhere to go, something to do, some way to make their fortune. The sea offered that. There was also the matter of politics. In Norway, where the mountains had kept communities separate for generations, there were, by the late 8th century, perhaps 30 small kingdoms, each with its own chieftain, its own proud tradition. When a powerful king like Harold, the one history would remember as Harold Fairhair for the wild mane of hair he reportedly refused to cut until he had united all of Norway under his rule, began to press those smaller kingdoms into submission, the proud and independent-minded chieftains and their followers had a choice: submit or leave. Many chose to leave. They loaded their families and their livestock and their tools and their ambitions onto their longships, and they went looking for somewhere new. And then there were the monasteries. Across the sea to the west and south, in the British Isles and along the coasts of Francia, the land we now call France, a different kind of wealth had been accumulating for generations. Christian monasteries had been gathering not just spiritual authority, but enormous material riches. Gold chalices and silver crosses and illuminated manuscripts with covers inlaid with gems, embroidered vestments, bronze bells, stores of grain and livestock, and these places of extraordinary wealth were, from the perspective of someone sailing past them in a longship, almost entirely unprotected, built on islands and headlands for spiritual solitude, not military defense, staffed by monks who did not carry swords. This was, to put it plainly, an invitation that some people found very difficult to refuse. The date is the 8th of June, in the year 793 of the Common Era. Off the northeastern coast of England, on a low, flat, sea-girt island called Lindisfarne, a place so holy that it was known simply as Holy Island, the monks of the abbey were going about their mourning. It was a gentle place, Lindisfarne, separated from the mainland by a tidal causeway that twice a day was covered by the sea. The monks had been here for well over a century. It was a centre of extraordinary learning and artistry. The monks of Lindisfarne had produced the Lindisfarne Gospels, a manuscript of such breathtaking beauty that even today, in a museum in London, it stops people in their tracks, makes them stand very still and simply look. The monks had presumably seen ships before. Ships moved along this coast regularly enough, but the ships that came that June morning were different, low and fast, their striped sails driving them in towards shore with alarming speed. and then the sails coming down and the oars running out, and the ships riding up onto the beach, and men, many men with weapons, pouring out of them onto the sand. What happened next was recorded in the horrified writings of scholars across England and Francia. The scholar Alcuin of York, one of the most learned men in Europe at the time, who was far away at the court of the Frankish king Charlemagne when he heard the news, wrote with something like disbelief, "Never before in Britain has such a terror appeared, nor was it thought that such an inroad from the sea could be made. The monks were killed, or thrown into the sea, or taken captive to be sold as slaves. The treasures were carried away, the gold and silver, the precious manuscripts, everything portable and valuable. And then the ships were pushed back into the water, the sails raised, and they were gone. The Viking Age had officially begun, but let us hold that moment gently without dwelling too long in its violence, because the story of the Viking Age is so much larger than any single raid, however dramatic. It is the story of one of the greatest movements of people in human history. It is the story of exploration and settlement and trade and the founding of cities and kingdoms. It is the story of a culture of extraordinary sophistication and creative power that was long misunderstood and only slowly came to be appreciated for what it truly was. Let your body grow heavier now, sinking into wherever you are resting. The story continues softly. Think of the world as it looked in those early decades of the 9th century, the 800s, from the deck of a Norse longship heading west. Behind you, the familiar coast of your homeland, the pine-dark cliffs and the silver flash of waterfalls tumbling into fjords. Ahead of you, the open North Sea, grey-green and cold, but navigable. You know how to read the currents. You know the birds. The presence of certain seabirds tells you roughly how far you are from land. You know how to use a simple device, perhaps a sun compass, to hold your course. You know the stars. The first places that came within reach were the British Isles. The Shetland Islands and Orkney, those wind-scoured archipelagos at the very top of Scotland, were so close to Scandinavia that they might as well have been visible on a clear day. Norse settlers began to arrive there not just as raiders but as farmers, bringing their cattle and their tools, building their longhouses on the green hillsides, learning to harvest the sea as well as the thin northern soil. The people who had been there before, the ancient Pictish inhabitants, gradually merged with the Norse newcomers over generations, creating a new culture, part Norse, part Celtic, entirely itself. Imagine standing on Orkney on an autumn evening. The sky is that deep, bruised purple-grey that northern skies get in October, and the sea is the colour of pewter, and the wind is constant and cold, and smells of salt and heather. The grass is close-cropped and bright green, and out across the sound you can see other islands, low and dark against the sky. In a longhouse a few hundred yards away, a fire is burning, and the smell of peat smoke drifts across the hillside, and someone is singing, a low, unhurried song in a language that is part Old Norse and part something older still. This was what settlement looked like, as opposed to raiding. Settlement was slow and domestic and ordinary, the establishment of farms, the raising of children, the negotiation of relationships with neighbouring communities, the gradual blending of languages and customs and bloodlines. The Norse who settled in Orkney and Shetland and the Western Isles of Scotland were not primarily warriors. They were farmers and fishermen and craftspeople who needed land and found it, and who made it their home. The same was true in Ireland. By the early 9th century, Norse settlers had established bases along the Irish coast, and from one of those bases, a sheltered harbour on the eastern coast, grew a settlement that would eventually become Dublin, one of the great cities of medieval Europe. The Norse called it Dyflin. For a time it was a Norse kingdom ruled by Norse kings, trading in slaves and silver and the many goods that passed through its busy harbour. The Norse and the Irish did not always get along. There were raids and counter-raids and battles and alliances and intermarriages, and out of that long, complicated interaction emerged a new people, the Norse Gaels, who were neither purely Norse nor purely Irish, but something new, something that the mixing of two strong cultures creates. Lean back a little more. Let your arms be still. The story drifts on like a ship on a calm sea. The North Atlantic was not, as many people in the rest of the world believed, a barrier at the western edge of the earth. To the Norse, it was another road, and they walked it, or rather sailed it, with a steadiness and a practical courage that is still astonishing to contemplate. From the coasts of Norway and the Northern Isles, the Faroe Islands were the next stepping stone. A small cluster of islands in the middle of the North Atlantic, their cliffs rising steeply from the sea, their plateaus green and windswept, their coastlines alive with seabirds. Norse settlers arrived in the Faroes in the 9th century and found them essentially uninhabited, or nearly so, perhaps a handful of Irish hermit monks who had sought solitude in the most remote place they could reach. The Norse settled in and built their farms and began to fish the extraordinarily rich waters and called the place the Faroe Islands, which simply means the Sheep Islands, because they brought sheep, and the sheep thrived on the green hills. And from the Faroes, Iceland. Iceland is one of the most extraordinary places on earth, and the Norse who discovered it and settled it must have understood that they had found something truly remarkable. A large island sitting on the mid-Atlantic ridge where two tectonic plates meet and pull apart, Iceland is geologically alive. Volcanoes and geysers and hot springs and fields of black lava that look like the surface of another world entirely. But it also has wide lowland plains of green pasture and rivers full of salmon and coastal waters teeming with fish and long summer days when the sun barely sets. The first Norse settler of Iceland, according to the sagas, was a man named Ingolfur Arnason, who arrived around 874 CE. The story goes that he cast the carved pillars of his high seat, a traditional piece of Norse domestic furniture, a kind of ceremonial chair, into the sea as his ship approached the coast, and vowed to settle wherever the gods caused those pillars to wash ashore. They came ashore in a bay where steam rose from hot springs in the ground, and Ingolfur named the place Reykjavik, Smoky Bay, and built his farm there. And so one of the world's most remarkable cities was founded by a man following the drift of a piece of carved wood on a cold ocean current. Over the following decades, Iceland was settled rapidly by Norse families from Norway and from the Norse communities already established in the British Isles. By around 930 CE, the settlers had established something genuinely unprecedented, the Althing, a parliament of sorts, a gathering of free landowners who met each summer in a great rift valley called Thingvellir to debate laws and settle disputes. It was one of the oldest representative assemblies in the world. People camped in booths of turf and wood along the river, and the greatest law speaker of the assembly would stand at the law rock and recite the laws from memory, all of them, from beginning to end, over the course of 3 summers. Imagine that gathering, hundreds of people, perhaps thousands, arriving on horseback from all over the island, the smell of cooking fires and horses and wet wool, the sound of many conversations in the long northern twilight, children running between the booths, old men arguing about boundary disputes that had been simmering for years, poets composing verses that would be remembered for generations. It was democracy of a rough and imperfect kind, but it was real, and it lasted, and its descendants still govern Iceland today. The settlements grew quieter in the telling. Let that image of Thingvellir settle in your mind, the green valley, the silver river, the long golden light of the midsummer evening, and let your breathing slow. Iceland was not the end of the road. It never is when the road is the sea and the people travelling it are Norse. From Iceland, looking west on a clear day, sometimes you could see something, a distant gleam, a shadow on the horizon. And the Norse went to find out what it was. Around 982 CE, a man named Eiríkur Thorvaldsson, known to history as Eric the Red for the colour of his hair and perhaps for the ferocity of his temper, was exiled from Iceland for manslaughter. He had killed a neighbour in a dispute. The sentence was 3 years of exile, which meant 3 years at sea with nowhere to go. So Eric sailed west, into waters that Norse sailors had glimpsed but not explored, and he found a large island, an enormous island, in fact, the largest island in the world, covered in the north and east by glaciers, but with a southern and western coast of sheltered fjords and green valleys and pastures that were genuinely livable. Eric called it Greenland, a name that might have been wishful thinking or might have been sincere. The green coastal strips were genuinely fertile by Norse standards, and when his exile was over, he went back to Iceland and convinced a fleet of colonists to follow him. Around 985 CE, somewhere between 14 and 25 ships set out from Iceland, heavily laden with livestock and tools and families and everything needed to start a new life from nothing. Not all of them made it across. Some turned back. Some were lost. But enough arrived in Greenland to establish 2 settlements, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement, that would survive for several centuries. Those Greenland Norse farmed and fished and kept livestock and traded, primarily in a remarkable commodity that the rest of Europe valued extremely highly: walrus ivory. The European demand for ivory was enormous, and walrus tusks from the waters around Greenland could substitute for elephant ivory from Africa. The Greenland Norse also traded in furs and in a strange luxury item that medieval Europeans found utterly fascinating: live polar bears. The gift of a live white bear to a king or a bishop was considered extraordinary, and the Greenland Norse occasionally managed to capture young ones and ship them alive to European courts, where they caused a sensation. But even Greenland was not the end. Around the year 1000 CE, we now know the exact date was 1021, thanks to remarkable detective work done by archaeologists and scientists more than 1,000 years later. Norse explorers and settlers reached the coast of North America. They called it Vinland, for the wild grapes or berries they found there. A man named Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, is credited in the sagas with the first deliberate voyage there, though others may have glimpsed the coast before him. The settlement they established at a place called L'Anse aux Meadows, at the northern tip of what we now call Newfoundland in Canada, was real. Archaeologists in the 1960s found the unmistakable remains of Norse longhouses there, and the Norse artifacts within them: iron rivets, a bronze pin of Norse design, the remains of a small iron forge. And analysis of wood samples from the site eventually allowed scientists to pin down the year of occupation with extraordinary precision. The year 1021. 500 years before Columbus, 500 years before any other European, Norse men and women stood on the coast of North America and built fires and cooked their food and heard the forest sounds of a continent entirely unknown to them, and looked out at the sea they had crossed, and perhaps thought about home. They did not stay long. The indigenous peoples of the region, whom the Norse sagas call the Skraelings, were numerous and well organized, and the Norse settlement was small and far from any support. After a few years, perhaps only 2 or 3, the settlement was abandoned. The Norse sailed back to Greenland and eventually back to Iceland, and for the most part, this extraordinary achievement faded from the wider world's awareness. But it happened. In the year 1021, Norse people stood on the soil of the Americas. The world had been crossed from one side to the other by ships of pine and oak, driven by sails of woven wool, guided by people who read the stars and the currents with the skill of lifelong intimacy. Let that image rest with you for a moment. Those longhouses at the edge of the forest in Newfoundland, the fire burning inside, the smell of pine and cold salt air, a woman sitting at a loom perhaps, the rhythmic clack and pull of the weaving, and outside the door a view of the sea, and beyond the sea, everything she has ever known, thousands of miles away. The Norse were not only sailing west, they were sailing east and south, and along rivers deep into continents that most people in their homeland would never see. Think of a different kind of journey, not the open ocean, but the rivers of what is now Russia and Ukraine and Belarus. The great rivers, the Dnieper, the Volga, the Don, were the highways of Eastern Europe in the Viking Age, and the Norse knew how to use them. A group of Swedish Norse, known in the East as the Varangians, or the Rus, began in the mid-8th century to establish trading posts along those rivers, moving southward through the vast flat forests of the north, trading with Slavic and Finnic peoples, buying furs and amber and slaves, and moving them southward toward the great markets. Imagine the journey down the Volga in early autumn. The river is wide and slow and brown, moving through endless forest of birch and alder, the leaves just beginning to turn yellow at the edges. The air is cool and smells of mud and fallen leaves. The boats are laden with goods, bales of fur, chests of amber, the clinking weight of silver coins. The crew speaks Old Norse among themselves, and fragments of Slavic, and signs that cross all languages. They travel for days, then weeks, the landscape gradually changing, the forest giving way to grassland, the river growing broader, and at the end of that long journey, something astonishing. The Caspian Sea, the markets of the Islamic world, silver dirhams from the Abbasid Caliphate, stamped with Arabic script, making their way northward in exchange for furs and amber and the other goods the Varangians could offer. These silver coins have been found in enormous quantities in Scandinavian archaeology, buried in hoards all across Norway and Sweden and Denmark. They tell a story of commerce that stretched from the forests of northern Russia to the workshops of Baghdad, with Norse traders as the link in the chain. And then there was the other route, the one that led not to the Caspian but to Constantinople, the great city at the meeting point of Europe and Asia, the seat of the Byzantine Empire, the richest city in the known world. The Varangians found their way there too, down the Dnieper and across the Black Sea. And when they arrived, they were impressive enough that the Byzantine emperors decided they would rather have these formidable northerners fighting for them than against them. The Varangian Guard was born, an elite corps of Norse warriors who served as the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperors. They were famous for their size and their ferocity and their loyalty, which was to their emperor personally, rather than to any political faction, which made them uniquely trustworthy in a court where political intrigue was a constant undertone. The Varangian Guard served the Byzantine emperors for centuries. When the Anglo-Saxon warrior aristocracy lost their lands after the Norman conquest of England in 1066, many of them made their way to Constantinople and joined the Guard as well. A remarkable detail, that among the bodyguards of the Byzantine emperor were men whose world had been transformed by the descendants of the very Norse warriors whose ancestors had raided their great-grandfathers' monasteries. The eastern connections of the Varangians brought extraordinary things back to Scandinavia and to Norse settlements in the west. Byzantine silk, the finest cloth in the world, has been found in Viking Age graves in Scandinavia. A cowrie shell from the Red Sea, a shell that should have no business being anywhere near the cold waters of the north, was found in Viking York. Coins from Samarkand in Central Asia have turned up in Swedish hoards. The world was more connected than we sometimes imagine, and the Norse were the connective tissue of a vast network that linked the forests of the north to the deserts of the south, the stone churches of Ireland to the minarets of the Caspian coast. And then there was Normandy. Let us spend a little time in Normandy. In the 9th century, the rivers of what we now call France, the Seine, the Loire, the Garonne, were, from the perspective of a Norse captain, an open invitation. Deep and navigable, they led straight into the heart of the Frankish kingdom, past abbeys and towns of great wealth that had been accumulating treasure for generations. The Norse were quick to realize this. They sailed up the rivers in their shallow-drafted longships, carrying out raids of devastating efficiency, and then retreating to the sea before a response could be organized. The kingdom of the Franks, which had been the greatest power in Western Europe under the Emperor Charlemagne, was by the mid-9th century fragmenting under the pressure of Charlemagne's quarrelling descendants, and the Norse raiders found that the response to their incursions was slow and poorly coordinated. Paris itself was besieged by a Norse fleet in 885 and 886 CE, a vast fleet, according to the chroniclers, of hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men, though those numbers may have grown in the telling. The city survived, but the disruption was enormous. In the end, the Frankish king Charles the Simple, who was not simple at all, but was simply a man dealing with a very difficult situation with whatever tools came to hand, made a decision of extraordinary pragmatic brilliance. If you cannot beat them, you hire them. In 911 CE, Charles made a treaty with a Norse chieftain named Rollo, a man of disputed origins, either Norwegian or Danish, large enough that he was reportedly too big to ride a horse, granting him a substantial territory in northern France, in exchange for which Rollo would defend that coastline against other Norse raiders, convert to Christianity, and swear loyalty to the Frankish crown. Rollo accepted, and the territory he was given became Normandy, the land of the Northmen. What happened next over the following generations is one of the most remarkable transformations in medieval history. The Norse settlers in Normandy did not simply impose their own culture on the local population. They were absorbed. They learned to speak the local Romance language. They built churches. They converted genuinely to Christianity, not just formally. They adopted Frankish customs of knighthood and cavalry warfare and feudal landholding. Within 3 or 4 generations, the Norse identity of the Norman ruling class had been largely subsumed into something new, something that called itself Norman, that spoke a dialect of French, that was ferociously Christian, and that had inherited from its Norse ancestors an appetite for expansion that had not diminished in the slightest. And in the year 1066, those Normans, the great-great-great-grandchildren of Norse raiders, crossed the English Channel under a duke named William, who had a claim to the English throne that he intended to press with the same directness and force that his ancestors had brought to the rivers of Francia. They landed on the coast of Sussex and marched north, and at a place near the town of Hastings they met the English King Harold Godwinson and his army, and they fought a battle that changed England forever. The Normans won. Harold was killed. William became King of England, and the ruling aristocracy of England was transformed almost overnight into a Norman French-speaking elite that would shape the English language, English culture, and English institutions for centuries to come. It is one of history's quiet ironies that England, the country whose shores had been terrorized by Norse raids for nearly 3 centuries, whose monks had prayed to be delivered from the fury of the Northmen, was in the end conquered not by Norse people, but by the Frenchified descendants of Norse people, whose ships crossed the Channel not from Scandinavia, but from the coast of Normandy. The Norse blood was still there, a few generations removed, flowing in the veins of the knights who rode into battle at Hastings. Let your thoughts drift slowly now, like leaves on still water. Let the images of all those voyages and settlements and transformations soften into something quieter, something more like a dream. There is another side to the Viking Age that is softer and more contemplative than the raids and the battles. It is the side that sat by the fire in the long winter nights and told stories, stories that became the Icelandic sagas, those extraordinary prose narratives written down in Iceland in the 12th and 13th centuries, but recording oral traditions that stretched back centuries further to the age itself. The sagas are unlike anything else in medieval literature. They are cool and spare in their prose style, almost journalistic. They record violence without flinching and without glorifying it. They create characters of remarkable psychological complexity. They describe landscapes with a precision that seems almost modern. The saga writers knew that the best way to make a reader feel the cold of an Icelandic winter was not to tell them how cold it was, but to describe the frost on the inside of the hall's wooden walls, the way the breath clouded in the air, the specific sound of ice forming on the edge of a river. These stories were told aloud in those long halls by firelight, while outside the snow fell and the wind moved through the pines. People listened for hours. Children fell asleep to the sound of stories about their ancestors' voyages and feuds and loves and deaths. The past was alive and present in those stories, and the people in them were not remote historical figures, but someone's great-grandfather, someone's great-grandmother's cousin, people whose blood ran in the veins of the people sitting around the fire listening. This is how history was preserved before writing, not in dusty chronicles kept by monks, but in living stories that passed from mouth to mouth again, carrying the weight of a people's memory across generations. The Norse built kingdoms, and not only in the places we have already visited. In the north of England, a Norse kingdom centred on the city of York, which the Norse called Jorvik, flourished in the 9th and 10th centuries. Jorvik was a prosperous trading city, and modern archaeology has revealed it in extraordinary detail. Archaeologists in the 1970s and 1980s excavated a site in York called Coppergate, Cupmaker Street in the Old Norse, and found preserved beneath the ground, in waterlogged soil that had kept organic materials intact for 1,000 years, the physical remains of everyday Viking Age life in extraordinary detail. They found leather shoes, still shaped to the feet that had worn them, wooden cups and bowls, still smooth from the hands that had turned them on a lathe, textile fragments still showing the colours of the dyes that had been used, madder red, weld yellow, woad blue. They found the bones of animals that had been butchered and eaten. They found the remnants of parasites that had lived in the intestines of the people of Jorvik, which tells us something uncomfortable but informative about the state of sanitation. They found evidence of 100 small industries and crafts: metalworking, amber carving, antler working, textile production, glass bead making. Jorvik was not a rough camp of barbarians. It was a sophisticated urban community embedded in trade networks that stretched from Dublin in the west to Samarkand in the east, producing goods of real quality and beauty and consuming goods from all over the known world. The Norse who ruled and lived in Jorvik were part of a broader political entity that scholars call the Danelaw, the area of northern and eastern England where Norse settlers and Norse law had become so established that it was simply the way things were done. Place names in the Old Danelaw still carry the Norse imprint today. Any English place name ending in by, Derby, Whitby, Grimsby is Norse, the suffix meaning a farm or settlement. Any name ending in thwaite is Norse, meaning a clearing. Hundreds of English words are Norse in origin: sky, window, knife, husband, law, happy, awkward, freckle, skull, trust. The Norse are woven into the fabric of the English language, present in words we use every day without thinking about where they came from. The hours grow quiet now. Let the words settle like snow, softly and slowly. The Viking Age did not end on a single day or in a single place. It faded gradually, the way the long northern summer fades into autumn, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the light changing, and the temperature dropping, and the days shortening, until one morning you wake up, and the world is different, and you understand that a season has ended. In Scandinavia, the change came partly through Christianity. Missionaries had been visiting the Norse world since the 9th century, with limited success. The Norse were not hostile to Christianity exactly. They tended to be pragmatic about religion, willing to add a new god to the existing ones if the new god seemed powerful and useful. Many Norse traders and mercenaries underwent a ritual called prime signing, a partial form of Christian initiation, which allowed them to do business in Christian communities without fully abandoning their old beliefs. But by the late 10th and early 11th centuries, Christianity was spreading more decisively through Scandinavia, carried by kings who used religious conversion as a tool of political unification. In the year 1000, according to tradition, Iceland converted to Christianity by a vote at the Althing, a remarkable moment, the parliament deciding collectively to change the religion of the nation with a compromise that allowed people to continue their old practices privately for a time, if they chose. By 1021, the same year that Norse settlers were building their longhouses in Newfoundland, Scandinavia was formally Christian, and the old gods were officially retired, though they lived on in stories and in the days of the week and in the deep memory of the land. The great kingdoms of Scandinavia were consolidating. Norway became a single kingdom, Denmark became a single kingdom, and for a time in the early 11th century, the Danish king Knut, known to history as Canute, ruled an empire that stretched across Denmark and Norway and England, a North Sea empire that was for a brief moment one of the most powerful political entities in the Western world. Canute was a capable and Christian king who made laws and built churches and corresponded with the Pope, and it is strange and wonderful to think that the ruler of this great northern empire was the heir, however distantly, of the same Norse tradition that had produced the raids on Lindisfarne. The Battle of Stamford Bridge in September 1066 is often cited as one of the traditional endpoints of the Viking Age. A Norwegian king named Harald Hardrada, Harald the Hard Ruler, and the name tells you something about the man, led a large fleet to England, claiming the English throne. He was met by the English king Harold Godwinson, who marched his army north with astonishing speed, and the two forces met at a bridge over the River Derwent in Yorkshire. The battle was fierce and decisive. Harold Hardrada was killed. The Norse invasion was repelled. 3 days later, news came that William of Normandy had landed in the south, and Harold turned his exhausted army around and marched them south again to Hastings and their defeat. The last great Norse king died on an English riverbank, and within weeks England was in the hands of the Normans, who were the last and most transformed expression of the same Norse expansion that had begun nearly 3 centuries earlier on the beaches of Lindisfarne. There are still places in the world today where you can feel the depth of the Norse imprint on the land. The northern and western isles of Scotland, where the place names are still Old Norse, and the coastline still looks exactly as it must have looked when Norse settlers first rowed their longboats into those sheltered harbours. Iceland, where the Althing still meets and the sagas are still read, and the language spoken today is so close to Old Norse that an Icelander can open a saga written 900 years ago and read it with only a little difficulty. Normandy, where the memory of the Norse origin is preserved in the very name of the region, the land of the Northmen. And York, where if you stand in the old Coppergate area and close your eyes, you might almost hear the sound of 1,000 years of accumulated human life, the creak of a wooden lathe, the tap of a cobbler's hammer, the smell of a cooking fire, the sound of a language that is not quite English and not quite anything else, drifting through an autumn evening. The Viking Age was not simply a time of raids and violence, though those things were real and their victims suffered genuinely and terribly. It was a time of extraordinary human creativity and courage and curiosity. It was a time when the known world expanded dramatically, when people who had been confined to a difficult and beautiful northern landscape took to the sea and discovered Iceland and Greenland and the coast of a continent no European had ever seen. It was a time when trade routes stretched from Newfoundland to Samarkand, when the silver of the Islamic world made its way into the hordes of Norwegian farmers, when a cowrie shell from the Red Sea ended up in the Viking city of York. The Norse brought violence, yes, they also brought language and law and art and the tradition of the assembly and ships of such extraordinary beauty and ingenuity that scholars still study them with admiration. They brought the sagas, that body of literature that remains one of the most remarkable achievements of medieval storytelling. They founded cities that are still cities today: Dublin, Kiev, Novgorod, Reykjavik,
They shaped the English language and the French language and the Russian language and the cultures of dozens of peoples who came into contact with them. They were not simple people, and the age they lived in was not a simple age. It was complicated and vivid and alive with the particular human combination of beauty and brutality that seems to mark every era of history if you look at it closely enough. But there was something about the Norse world, something in the combination of that dramatic landscape and that extraordinary technology of the longship and that particular cultural tradition of daring and exploration that produced, for 2.5 centuries, one of the most extraordinary expansions of human presence and human influence that the world has ever seen. The fire in the longhouse is burning low now. Outside, the snow is falling, slow and steady, covering the world in quiet white. The last of the evening's story has been told, the last of the voices has faded, and the people around the fire are growing still, their eyes heavy, their breathing slow. The children have already drifted into sleep, tucked under heavy wool blankets, their faces soft and dreaming. Even the oldest members of the household, the ones who remember the most stories, the ones whose voices had been telling tales since the fire was bright, are quiet now, leaning into the warmth of the last embers. Outside, the sea is calm tonight. The longships are beached for winter, hauled up above the tide line, their hulls tarred and their sails stowed, and they are resting in the way that only things built for motion can rest, patient and ready, and containing within their curved forms the memory of every wave they have ever crossed. The wind has dropped. The stars are out, hard and cold and brilliant above the dark hills. And somewhere across the water, across the North Sea, across the North Atlantic, across all those miles of dark, cold, beautiful water that the Norse people knew as well as they knew the faces of their families, somewhere far away, the world is resting too. The monasteries and the trading towns, the river settlements and the island kingdoms, the longhouses in Iceland and the turf farms in Greenland, even the brief ghostly outline of those houses at the edge of the Newfoundland forest, 500 years before anyone would understand what they meant. All of it is resting, all of it is still. The Viking Age lasted roughly 2.5 centuries, and in those centuries the world was remade in ways that echo down to today, in our language, in our place names, in our laws, in the very genetic inheritance of millions of people across Europe and the North Atlantic and beyond. It was an age of people who refused to be confined by the limits of the known, who looked at the open sea and saw not an ending but a beginning, who built ships beautiful enough to move through any water in the world, and who left behind, in stone and in saga and in the living tissue of human culture, a record of extraordinary human possibility. But all ages end, as all stories end, as all evenings end. The embers cool, the fire settles into its own soft ash.
The snow falls on the longships and on the winter fields, and on the graves of the people who built and sailed and fought and settled and sang, and the world they made goes on quietly without them, carrying their memory forward in ways they could never have imagined. Rest now. Let the cold northern air of all those centuries settle around you like a blanket. Let the sound of the sea against the hull of a longship become the sound of your own slow breathing, rhythmic and steady and ancient as the tides. The people who sailed those ships are long asleep beneath the green hills of Scandinavia and the black lava fields of Iceland and the long soft coastlines of everywhere they ever went. Their voyages are over, and their fires are out, and their stories are told. But they sailed, they really sailed, all the way to the edge of the world and beyond. And that is worth carrying with you into sleep, a quiet and beautiful thing. The knowledge that human beings are capable of extraordinary things when they follow the current of their deepest curiosity out past the last known headland and into the open sea. The water is still, the stars are bright. Sleep now, gently and deeply, carried on a current that has been running since the beginning of the world.